Thank you very much. Well, you can already feel the air is on edge already. It's going to be an exciting evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the great debate, Creation Evolution, sponsored by OSU Bible Studies. We are certainly glad you came tonight to witness what could be one of the most stimulating events in Columbus this year. And I would like to explain some of the ground rules for tonight's debate. For those of you who were here a little bit earlier, we had a coin toss to determine which speaker would go first. Dr. Shore won the coin toss and selected to receive. Downwind. That's right. So Dr. Gish will be starting his presentation in a moment. But first of all, we need your cooperation. For this debate to be a success, we need your help in this way. We would like each one of you to make sure you fill out the survey that you've been handed, and even take a quick note at the survey right now. It's very important that you fill in a blank in the top left-hand corner of your survey, that you fill in the answer to your understanding, your ideas on the creation evolution topic, whether you're a strong evolutionist, intermediate, or not sure, or a strong creationist. We'd like you to fill that answer out right now before the debate begins. The top part of the survey is anonymous. You can fill out that part of the survey. After the debate is done, make sure you tear that part off and you'll hand that to an usher as you leave. If you'd like further information concerning the debate and related topics, if you like the cassette tapes from this time, or if you would prefer a videotape, we're videotaping that also. Fill out the blank in the bottom and we'll send you some information on that. If you didn't get a survey as you came in, you may pick one up at intermission from an usher. There will be refreshments served during the break, which is about 15 minutes long. Also, to conduct this debate in an orderly fashion, we request that there be no interruptions from the audience. Both Dr. Shore and Dr. Gish have traveled many miles to come here tonight to debate one another, not us. If you would like to debate one of these men, you will have to reserve another night. And I hear Mershon has a couple nights open. If you have a question, please hold it until the end, and then after the debate, you'll have some time to personally ask each one your personal question. So we really appreciate your cooperation in this. Secondly, I would like to explain the format for the present debate. The question to be debated is this: the theory of evolution is superior to the theory of special creation as an explanation for the scientific evidence related to origins. Now, the format will consist of this time sequence. Dr. Shore will have 60 minutes to present his position, and then Dr. Gish will also have 60 minutes to present his position. And they'll have slides throughout the time, and it's going to go fast. And after they both present their position, then we're having the intermission of 15 minutes. And we want to be pretty punctual on that. We want to get started right at 15 minutes. And at that point, we're going to have 2 periods of rebuttals. The first period is 15 minutes each. The second period is 5-minute rebuttal. And then we're going to change gears a little bit, and then we're going to have Dr. Gish and Dr. Shore cross-examine one another through the things that they've talked through tonight. And that will consist of basically firing a question at one, and the other will answer in 2 minutes. And then he'll have a time to answer back in 2 minutes, and an answer back in 2 minutes, and then finally answer back in 2 minutes. It's going to be on a firing line. So that's our basic format tonight. And now finally, and most importantly, I would like to introduce our distinguished guest. On my right is Dr. Shore, Dr. Stephen Shore. He's a professor at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. And on my left here is Dr. Dwayne Gish. He's an associate director of the Institute for Creation Research. And I'd like to give you a little background of our speakers tonight. Dr. Stephen Shore graduated from the University of Toronto in 1978. He got his PhD in astronomy. He was born in 1953. He has written over 50 scientific papers. He belongs to the Science News. He's a Science News Officer of American Astronomical Society. He's a visiting assistant professor here of astronomy as of 1981, and also in Rochester as of 1983. He belongs to the NATO Fellowship as of 1983. He was just appointed a senior member of the Space Telescope Science Institute. He's the author of the article of stellar evolution and black holes for the Van Nostrand Science Encyclopedia. Professor Shore's most recent observational work pertains to the study of the most massive stars in the Magellanic Clouds using optical and satellite ultraviolet spectroscopy. It's a good word. It's a mouthful. Yes. The study of upper main sequence helium-rich magnetic spectrum variables and observations of dynamics and structure of the interstellar medium using the International Ultraviolet Explorer. Professor Shore is a member of the International Astronomical Union, the American Astronomical Society, and the History of Science Society. He also is an active participant in the IAU working groups on chemically peculiar stars and stellar activity. Would you please welcome Dr. Shore? Dr. Dwayne Gish received a BS degree with a major in chemistry from the University of California at Los Angeles in 1949. He was elected to the UCLA chapter of Phi Beta Kappa and Phi Sigma Upsilon, a chemical honorary fraternity. He received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, in 1953, majoring in biochemistry. From 1953 to 1955, he was a Lilly postdoctoral fellow in the natural sciences at Cornell University Medical College. And in 1956, he held the position of assistant professor of biochemistry at that institution. While at Cornell University Medical College, he collaborated with Dr. Vincent du Vigeneau, Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, and several others, in synthesis of one of the hormones of the pituitary gland. In the fall of 1956, Dr. Gish joined the research staff of the Virus Laboratory of the University of California, Berkeley. While there, he collaborated with Dr. Wendell M. Stanley, Nobel Prize winner in medicine, and several others, in elucidating the chemical structure of the protein of tobacco mosaic virus. From 1960 to 1971, Dr. Gish was a member of the research staff of the Upjohn Company, a pharmaceutical firm in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where he was a research associate in the Department of Hypersensitive Diseases Research. During these years, Dr. Gish was engaged in the synthesis of drugs with hormonal, anti-cancer, and immunosuppressant activities. For many years, Dr. Gish's avocation had been the study of the scientific evidence related to the question of creation versus evolution theory. In the fall of 1971, he resigned his position with the Upjohn Company to devote full time to this work. He is now the Associate Professor, Director of the Institute for Creation Research in San Diego. Dr. Gish has published numerous technical articles and has written many articles and lectured extensively on the subject of the scientific evidence against evolution and on other Bible science topics. He is listed in American Men of Science and in Who's Who in the Midwest. Would you please welcome Dr. Dwayne Gish?
Well, thank you very much, Doug. Dr. Shore, ladies and gentlemen, certainly my pleasure to be here tonight and to present for your consideration some of the results of the research on this subject of origins by creation scientists. I'm certainly glad the temperature's warmed up a little bit here in Columbus. It was 85 degrees where I live in California on Monday, and I didn't want to come here to 0 degrees, so I appreciate very much your lovely weather. The late Harlow Shapley, an astronomer at Harvard University, said that some people piously proclaim in the beginning God. I say in the beginning hydrogen. And he stated or believed that starting with hydrogen gas and the laws of science which are operating in the universe today and sufficient time, one could explain the origin of everything. Of course, he could do no such thing, but this was consistent with his basic philosophy and belief. You see, evolutionists assume, that is one of the more popular theories on the origin of the universe, is that all the matter in the universe was crammed together in some huge cosmic egg some billions of years ago. Now, no one has the foggiest notion where the cosmic egg came from or how it got there. Someone suggested perhaps a cosmic chicken laid the cosmic egg. Well, who knows? But for some strange reason, this cosmic egg exploded and generated hydrogen gas, which expanded out into the then universe. And the universe then has created itself from this hydrogen gas. And that includes stars and galaxies in our solar system and all living things, including people. Someone has said, well, if this is true, then we could say that hydrogen is an odorless, tasteless, invisible gas, which, if given sufficient time, becomes people. And of course, this is precisely what the theory says. I presume this is what Dr. Shore believes, that we then have eventually come from hydrogen gas. Well, I find that rather incredible, scientifically to say the very least. Now, this theory, as we will see, is a totally mechanistic, naturalistic theory. Now, of course, not all evolutionists are atheists, but it is a non-theistic theory. The evolutionist is saying that he can go out in the world as it now exists, the universe as it now exists, and study the natural laws and natural processes and now operating and utilizing his knowledge of those natural laws and processes, plus nothing, he can explain the origin of everything. So then God is simply not necessary. By definition, he is excluded. Now, I want to contrast that to the creation position, but first I think we had better define what we mean by evolution. I'm going to let Sir Julian Huxley, the British biologist and evolutionist, do that for us. May we have the first slide, please? On this slide, we see the definition of evolution. Now, we probably want to, yes, thank you. Huxley has said that evolution in the extended sense can be defined as a directional and essentially irreversible process occurring in time, which in its course gives rise to an increase of variety and an increasingly high level of organization in its products. Our present knowledge indeed forces us to the view that the whole of reality is evolution, a single process of self-transformation. End of quote. Note, please, ladies and gentlemen, this is a process of self-transformation. Matter was sufficient to do it all. No outside intervention of any kind was required. Notice, furthermore, that it's directional. It has gone from the primordial chaos to the cosmos. We have gone from disorder to order. We have gone from simple to complex. Further note that, according to Huxley, it includes everything. The stars, the planets, all living things on this earth, our consciousness, our ability to think of the past, and to plan for the future. Even our faith in God is just a product of this evolutionary process. Now, this is what I call sometimes a molecule to man theory of evolution, or the fish to Gish theory of evolution. So we've got to understand that we are talking about that. That's what we're talking about, this grand scheme of evolution, the general theory of evolution. Now, we want to contrast that to creation. Now, the creation scientist says, no, that's not possible. Through our understanding of natural laws and natural processes, it is possible to establish the fact that the universe could not have created itself, that life could not have arisen spontaneously on this earth by any combination of natural processes of which we are aware. And furthermore, the historical record, the fossil record, is strong support that these things did not come into being gradually and slowly during many hundreds of millions of years of time. Now, the creation scientist says, therefore, if the universe could not have created itself, then it had to be created supernaturally. Its origin is due to something outside of the natural universe, something independent of the natural universe. Science does not tell us who that creator is, does not tell us why he created us, it does not tell us whether there is, if any, relationship between the created and the creator, or what our destiny may be. But we believe science can establish the fact that indeed this universe and man and all living things were created. The creation scientist says that this creator brought things into being directly, using processes that are not operating in the universe today. The creation scientist says that this creator, and if you'll excuse me, I'll refer to this creator as God. Personally, I do believe that this is the God that we find described in the Bible, but that's not part of the debate tonight. We're talking about the scientific evidence. But this God then created each one of the basic types of living things, plants and animals. The dog kind, the cat kind, the canary kind, the eagle kind, monkey kind, gorilla kind, chimpanzee kind, and mankind. These various types, onions and roses and so forth, were each separately created. They have not arisen from a common ancestor. Right from the start, a dog was a dog, a cat was cat, and man was man. Now, obviously, the Creator used processes that are not operating today, and then fundamentally, there is no way for us to know how God created. But that is not unique to the creationists. The same problem is true for the evolutionists as well. No one knows where the cosmic egg came from, why it exploded, or why any of these things happened, or how they began. Nobody knows that. And as a matter of fact, evolutionists really don't know the mechanism of evolution. They're saying so more and more today. They really don't know the mechanism of evolution. But really, what we are trying to do here this evening is to establish the truth about origins. And I wanted to say that basically neither creation nor evolution is a scientific theory. They have scientific attributes. We can think of them scientifically. We can construct scientific models, but neither qualifies as a scientific theory because there were no human witnesses to the origin of the universe. There were no human witnesses to the origin of life. As a matter of fact, there were no human witnesses to the origin of a single living thing. Those things happened only once in the past. And we cannot go into the laboratory today and recapitulate the origin of the universe or use some theory to see if we can change a fish into an amphibian or ape into man or to create life. We can't do that. Creation and evolution are inferences based upon circumstantial evidence. Neither is more scientific than the other, and each is as religious as the other because they involve our basic view of reality. Well, is it possible then to establish what is true? Were we created, or did we really evolve? Is there some way to do that? Yes, I think there is. We have the products of either creation or evolution. What we find in the fossil record either was produced by a long, gradual, evolutionary process, or these living things were created. And what we would find in that fossil record then would be very different based upon creation on one hand or evolution on the other. Furthermore, we have studied natural laws and natural processes. The evolutionist says that he's explaining the origin of everything based upon those natural laws and natural processes, plus nothing. Therefore, the theory of evolution must be in accord with these natural laws. There must be no contradiction between natural laws and the theory of evolution. So we can, at least, we can attempt to infer, you see, what has happened in the past. And that's what we want to try to do this evening. Now, first of all, we can compare each one of these two models, the creation model and the evolution model, to the natural laws and processes that are operating now in this universe, and see if these processes are in accord with creation or evolution. And then we can go look at the fossil record, take a look at the past, and see if what we find there is in accord with what we would expect or predict on the basis of creation on one hand or evolution on the other hand. When that is done, we are convinced that this evidence provides marvelous support for creation, and on the other hand presents some notorious difficulties for evolution theory. Now, first of all, let's consider the science of thermodynamics. This is, I believe, critically important, this matter of thermodynamics. You see, according to evolutionary theory, this universe started with an explosion. Now, I've never seen an explosion generate order. Explosions generate chaos and disorder. And certainly hydrogen gas is a cloud of hydrogen gas, or a universe with nothing but hydrogen gas, is much simpler than the present universe. With its 100 billion galaxies, 100 billion stars in every galaxy, and all of these complicated things here on Earth, certainly this is a very complicated universe. So we have gone from simple to complex, from disorder to order. And if that is true, then matter must have this inherent capability, this intrinsic property of promoting itself from disorder to order, from simple to complex. And that tendency must be so powerful that it has created everything in this universe from hydrogen gas. And we should, as scientists, be able to go out into our world, take a look, and discover and describe this inherent property of matter to promote itself from disorder to order, from simple to complex. And today we would have some natural law or set of natural laws which describe this inherent property of matter. On the other hand, if creation is true, we could expect that God would have created the universe in a state of perfection. Well, obviously it's not in a state of perfection today, but we could assume that it started in a state of perfection. And if that were the case, certainly we would not predict, we would not expect that matter would have this intrinsic ability to promote itself from disorder to order, from simple to complex. We would not expect that. But if anything has happened since creation to alter the initial created state, it could only lead to a deteriorative process, to a downward process. We might detect some intrinsic ability or tendency of matter to go from complex to simple, from order to disorder. I think those are reasonable predictions based upon these two models. Now, what do we find in this real universe? What do we find out there? Well, first of all, let me point out that no scientist has ever detected any inherent tendency of matter to go from disorder to order, from simple to complex. That is something no scientist has ever discovered. There is no such tendency anywhere in this universe. All natural systems, on the other hand, tend to go in exactly the opposite direction. There is a universal natural tendency of matter to go from order to disorder, from complex to simple. That is what we actually find. That's true of everything, as we will see. The next slide, please. We have here a statement by Dr. Isaac Asimov, published in the Smithsonian Institute Journal, June of 1970. And listen to what Dr. Asimov has to say. By the way, I had the privilege of debating Dr. Asimov in the pages of Science Digest. That was in October of 1981. And you can be certain I quoted this statement in my portion of that debate. But Dr. Asimov says that another way of stating the second law then is the universe is constantly getting more disorderly. Viewed that way, we can see the second law all about us. we have to work hard to straighten a room, but left to itself, it becomes a mess again, very quickly and very easily. Even if we never enter it, it becomes dusty and musty. How difficult to maintain houses and machinery and our own bodies in perfect working order. How easy to let them deteriorate. In fact, all we have to do is nothing. And everything deteriorates, collapses, breaks down, wears out, all by itself. And that is what the second law is all about. End of quote. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if we have this second law of thermodynamics, one of the most well-established natural laws known in science, and that is what the second law is all about, it seems to me that indeed evolution is in trouble. Notice, everything in this universe, stars, our own sun. You know, if there is no God, or if God should not choose to intervene, this universe has one certain destiny. It's going to die. The day will come when our sun and every star in the universe will have exhausted its fuel. They will grow cold and dark. All activity will cease. Well, the universe will still be here. It'll just be dead. Now, that's a certain destiny of this universe, if there is no God. That's the way things are going. That's true of stars, true of our bodies, true of our machines. Everything, right down to the level of the atom. Now, my question is this. You see, the universe is running down. It's deteriorating. It's dying. That's the way natural laws and natural processes are now taking this universe. And my question is this. If the natural laws and natural processes that are now governing this universe are leading inexorably to its destruction and its death, and if, as evolutionists believe, these natural laws are all there is and all there ever has been, then how could those very same natural laws and processes have created the universe in the first place? Is it possible for the very same natural processes which are destroying the universe to have been responsible for its origin in the first place? Well, that's not rational. That's not scientific. That's incredible. Anybody to believe such a thing? You see, we find now the natural laws are directly contradictory to the theory of evolution. If an evolutionist says, I am going to explain everything according to natural laws, and he finds a contradiction like this, then he should abandon his theory. But that is not what is done at all. Now, this second law of thermodynamics says this, if it says anything, that if you have an isolated system, of course an isolated system is a system into which nothing is being brought in from the outside. No work is being performed on that system by anything on the outside. It's an isolated system. Everything that takes place within it is a process of self-transformation. The second law of thermodynamics says that system can go in one direction, it will go downward. It will inevitably, with time, become more disorderly, more random with time. Never, absolutely never, can it become more ordered and more complex and more highly structured. And yet, evolutionists believe this universe is an isolated system. That's what they say. The universe is an isolated system. So there's absolutely no question about the second law applying to the universe itself and to the origin of the universe. They believe the universe is an isolated system which started in a state of chaos and disorder and simplicity and has transformed itself into this highly ordered, highly complex, and highly structured universe that we have today. Clearly in violation of the second law of thermodynamics. Now, that's not possible. This universe could not have created itself. It doesn't make any difference what anybody believes about it. If science is science, that could not have happened. Now, there's much more that we could say about thermodynamics if I had time, but there's much more I want to talk about. So maybe we could come back to that later. What about the matter of probability? Obviously, we live in an incredibly complex universe. Living things are unbelievably complex. Do you know that life, that living cell, is so complex, I don't care how long man has to study it and do research on it. There will always be some things that he doesn't understand about it. I don't care if he can study forever. Man will never know everything there is to know about life. It is so incredibly complex. And then we have this organization of human beings, 30 trillion cells in our body with 200 varieties, 12 billion brain cells, with 120 trillion connections in our human brain. Think of that, 120 trillion connections. And evolutionists say we are just a product of millions of mistakes. So your human brain has been produced by millions and millions of DNA accidents over billions of years of time, we are told. That's what they tell us, and that's what they believe, and that's what is being taught in our schools today. I find the idea, again, incredible. In the next slide, please, we take a quick look at ribonuclease, an enzyme, a protein enzyme. Most of you know that proteins are made up of amino acids. There are 20 different kinds in these proteins today. Now, on the hypothetical primordial Earth, there would have been hundreds. But let's just assume there were only 20 to make it easier for the evolutionists. Now, the activity of this structure, this ribonuclease, is an enzyme that catalyzes the breakdown of ribonucleic acid, and it does it with unbelievable speed. And then we have human growth hormone, 188 amino acids, and insulin, and hundreds and thousands of other proteins. Some are hormone, some are enzyme, some are structural proteins, some bear oxygen like hemoglobin. Why is this ribonuclease, this particular arrangement of amino acids, why does it catalyze the chemical breakdown of ribonucleic acid, the hydrolysis of ribonucleic acid? Why does human growth hormone regulate our growth? Well, I wished I'd got a lot more of it, been a little taller. But why do these proteins have this specific activity? It is because of the precise arrangement of those amino acids. Here I have a message in English language. Now, first of all, we have to agree on the convention. We have to agree about the language. I mean, the paper and the ink can't do that. That's done by human beings. Only human beings can do that. We have to agree, first of all, what these words mean. But then after we have done that, we still have to put those letters together in precise order. Now, you give a monkey a typewriter, give him all the paper in the world, let him type away, almost forever, well, 100 billion years, 1,000 billion years, he'd never come up with that message without any spelling errors. That message is there because those letters had been precisely arranged. Now, the same is true of these proteins. Oh, you can do some finagling here, you can do some rearranging, but not much. Much of that molecule must be precise. Now, how did that happen? Well, the evolution says, just by chance, just accidentally, those amino acids happened to get together, and that happened. You see, there was no master biochemist, there was no creator, there was no intelligence, there was no organic chemist, there was no nothing. And so that just happened by chance. Well, you just calculate the probability of getting that one molecule by chance, and you see that it will never happen. Not in 5 billion years, and not in the assumed 20 billion years of this universe. If you calculate the probability of just getting one protein of 20 different kinds of amino acids, 100 different amino acids, that's got 124. Let's cut it down to 100. 100 amino acids, 20 different kinds. If you had to do that by chance, well, you'd only have one chance out of 20 of getting the first amino acid right. You'd have 1 over 20 times 1 over 20 of getting the first two in the right order. That's one chance out of 400. You'd have 1 over 20 times 1 over 20 times 1 over 20 of getting the first three in the right order, and that's 8,000, one chance out of 8,000. And then 4 would be one chance out of 160,000. And by the time you got 100 of them in the right order, and I don't care if it had to happen all at once or sequentially, it doesn't make any difference. You don't alter the probability. The probability of getting a single protein of 100 amino acids, 20 different kinds of amino acids, of getting that by chance is one chance out of 10 to the 130th power. That's 1 followed by 130 zeros. I assure you that's zero. That's just zero. Let me tell you how big that number is. If we took this entire universe and just filled it with electrons, I mean, so there's not a cubic inch of space left over. We just jammed this universe full of electrons. Not a cubic inch of space left over. How many electrons could you get in the universe? About 10 to the 130th power. The same number of different ways that you can arrange these amino acids. Now, here's the probability. We are going to pack the universe, absolutely jam-packed solid with electrons, and then we put your name on one of those electrons, and we send you out in the universe to find the electron with your name on it. By the time you have found that electron, we will have arranged those amino acids by chance. Now, you know you'd hunt for trillions times trillions times trillions times trillions of years and never find that electron. Well, you could try for trillions of years, you never get a single molecule either. But what if it did happen? Supposing it did happen, what would you have? One single molecule of one single protein. But to get life by evolution in an ocean containing 350 million cubic miles of water, you have to have billions of tons of every one of those proteins and amino acids and so forth. You'd have to have billions of tons of all the DNA and RNA molecules, which are even more complex. You'd have to have billions of tons of thousands of molecules, and you still wouldn't have life. The next slide shows just the arrangement of a living cell. And the living cell is incredibly complex with membranes and energy factories and protein factories and all kinds of complex things and genetic material, all arranged in just precise order. Everything has to be coordinated in time and space. Remember, there is no natural tendency for molecules to get together in any meaningful way. There's no natural tendency for it to do that. If you have any sort of complex system, on the other hand, the tendency is to break down, is to deteriorate and go in the other direction. So you would never get a living cell by any process of chemistry and physics or combination of natural laws we have operating on this earth today, regardless of how long we had for the process. The next slide, we see an article that appeared in the Daily Express of London in August 14th, 1981. Two skeptical scientists put their heads together and reach an amazing conclusion. There must be a God. Well, that wasn't quite such an amazing conclusion to me, but it was to these two gentlemen, because when they began this study that led to this conclusion, they were both atheists. One of these scientists was Sir Fred Hoyle, the British astronomer, long known as an anti-theist and an evolutionist, and his friend, Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe, professor and chairman of the Department of Applied Mathematics and Astronomy, University College, Cardiff, Wales, also an atheist when he began the study. These two scientists made certain assumptions about the minimum requirement for life, and then they calculated the probability of this happening in 5 billion years on this planet. The probability turned out to be absolutely nil, zero. One chance out of 10 to the 40,000th power, one followed by 40,000 zeros. But they said obviously that would never happen, not here on Earth. But after all, we have 100 billion galaxies. Each galaxy has 100 billion stars. Let us assume that every star has a planet like the Earth. Let us assume that the universe is 20 billion years old. Now let's calculate the probability of life evolving anywhere in the universe in that 20 billion years. The answer came back, for all practical purposes, forget about it. It's nil, it's zero, no probability whatsoever. They therefore concluded that evolution was impossible, therefore life had to be created, therefore there must be a God. Sir Fred Hoyle said the probability of evolution is equal to the probability that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard would assemble a Boeing 747. Now, I always tell people, if you want to believe that, that's okay, go right ahead. But please don't call it science. Now, to me, I would think if that evidence is sufficient to convince these two lifelong atheists, it ought to be strong enough to convert anybody if their minds are open. Now, they're not Christians. They don't believe the Bible, anything like that. But so they have not become creationists because of their religion. They became creationists in spite of their religion, you see. It was the nature of the scientific evidence that absolutely convinced them. All right, now let's leave this area, and I could spend hours and hours on the subject. Let's get down to the fossil record. What would we expect if evolution were true? Well, I think we all realize if evolution has produced millions of species during hundreds of millions of years of time, starting with a little single-cell organism, through all these genetic mistakes, it's gradually produced everything living today, then the fossil record should be full of transitional forms, these intermediate types. Well, I wouldn't be here tonight You wouldn't be here tonight. There'd be no debate. There'd be no question. There'd be no discussion. Evolution would be as obvious to anyone. Because if these millions of species, you see, have been produced by such a process, there would be billions times billions times billions of these things that would have lived and died during that many millions of years of time, and our museums would be just overflowing with all of these transitional forms. We have 250,000 different fossil species in our museums today. 250,000. That's more than an adequate sampling of the fossil record to establish the fact of evolution, if that is the case. On the other hand, if creation is true, we'd expect something very different. We'd expect animals and plants in great complexity to appear abruptly, suddenly, fully formed. We would expect to find fossils of each one of these basic types. We call them created kind. We'd expect to find fossils of each one of these basic types, but no transitional form. You see, whatever we're talking about, onion, jellyfish, or man would be man from the start, jellyfish from the start, or an onion from the start. No transitional form, no evidence of these intermediate types. Well, let's take a look at the fossil record now and see what we find. Actually, it is a tremendous embarrassment to evolutionists. It was to Darwin, and he recognized it. And today, more and more evolutionists are beginning to acknowledge that there is little or no evidence for gradual change in the fossil record. 120 years after Darwin, the missing links are still missing. In fact, the fossil record is so bad that the British scientist and evolutionist Dr. Mark Ridley, in an article published in New Scientist, volume 90, 1981, on page 830, stated that no real evolutionist uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to spatial creation. No real evolutionist, he said, would ever use the fossil record to support evolution versus creation, whether you believe in gradual evolution, hopeful monster evolution, or what. He said you wouldn't use the fossil record. Now, why does he say that? Because he knows how bad the fossil record is for evolution. And he says, well, we just don't use the fossil record to support evolution. No real evolutionists would do that. Well, I'm interested to see what Dr. Shore does about the fossil record here tonight. If he uses the fossil record, then according to Dr. Mark Ridley, he's not a real evolutionist. Now, we find that the gaps, the absence of transitional form between the higher categories, between phyla, classes, orders, families, are systematic and almost always large. I want to take a quick look, first of all, at the origin of man. Now, we need an hour and a half or 2 hours to do this, so it's going to have to be very quick. But I'd like to have the next slide, please. On this slide, we see a reconstruction of a creature whose scientific name is Australopithecus. This is Dr. Louis Leakey's so-called Ginjanthropus. It's Australopithecus robustus, actually, discovered by Dr. Leakey and his wife Mary. This creature, and this is just one representative, there's others, I'll mention Donald Johanson shortly, but this creature has occupied he has been the central figure in human evolutionary schemes for many years, and he is today. Now you can see he's grossly ape-like, the Australopithecus robustus, grossly ape-like, but it was claimed that this creature walked upright and that his teeth were slightly more man-like than those of apes. Now, more recently, Donald Johanson has discovered fossils of creatures to which he has given the name Australopithecus afarensis. One of those creatures, about 40% complete, was of a female. He called her Lucy, and he's become famous for his discovery of Lucy. Now, Johanson says that these creatures were essentially apes from the neck up. They had the jaws, the teeth, face, and brains of apes, but that they walked upright. So now we have a creature here that was essentially an ape, and yet he walked upright. And so you see we have something then on its way to becoming people. And this is what is taught in almost all of our textbooks. It's taught in almost all of our universities. It's what we see on television and National Geographic and so forth. This idea, we had this ancient ape-like creature that was quite ape-like, yet it was on its way to becoming people because it walked upright. That is the consensus of evolutionists today. But there are some who do not agree with that analysis. Lord Zuckerman, Dr. Solly Zuckerman, was for many years the head of the Department of Anatomy at the University of Birmingham in Britain. He was first knighted for his distinguished scientific career and then raised to the peerage. He's Lord Zuckerman today. Lord Zuckerman had a scientific team that spent many years studying these creatures. And by the way, the fossils that Lord Zuckerman was studying was supposed to be 1 to 2 million years younger or more recent than Don Johansson's Lucy. So they should be more man-like. They should be more advanced, if anything. But after these many years of research, Lord Zuckerman and his scientific team have concluded that these creatures did not walk upright. They were not intermediate between ape and man. They were just apes. Dr. Charles Oxnard, now professor of anatomy and anthropology, University of Southern California, has continued his studies on these creatures also for many years, the postcranial skeleton, the foot bones, hand bones, the pelvis, the knee joints, and so forth and so on. And he likewise has concluded that these creatures did not walk upright like man at all, that they had a mode of locomotion similar to the orangutan. They were not intermediate between ape and man. Now, you see, if these people are right, if Zuckerman is right and Oxnard is right, and by the way, there's been a whole spate of published papers recently in which the scientists have taken issue with Don Johansson as interpretation. They're not going quite as far as Oxnard and Zuckerman, but they are saying that these creatures certainly show a lot of features that we'd expect for something that lived in the trees. The next slide shows, I think, something that's very, it gives us some real clue here. Now, in the upper portion of the slide, you see on the right the pelvis of Australopithecus. In the middle, you see two human pelves. On the left, you see the pelvis of the chimpanzee. Now, in this view, it's plain to everybody that the pelvis of this creature, this fossil, Australopithecus, is more like man than it is like the ape on the left. And I've seen this slide in debates. I've had evolutionists present this to the audience. Look for yourself. But Dr. Oxnard pointed out that if you just take that pelvis now and rotate it so that you're looking at it in the angle below, now you see the pelvis of Australopithecus on the right is almost identical to that of the chimpanzee on the left and very unlike that of man in the middle. And Dr. Oxnard pointed out if you continue to do that, continue to rotate that pelvis in many different angles, so you're looking at it from many different perspectives, you will find that it is not intermediate. This creature did not walk upright, but he had a mode of locomotion similar to the orang. Yet, we are all taught that these creatures undoubtedly walked upright, tremendous evidence for the origin of man. I wished I had time to discuss other things, but let me point out very quickly, we have to be a little skeptical about what these people are telling us from the track record of what has gone on in the past. The next slide, please. Oh, first let me consider this statement by Lord Zuckerman. This is the conclusion of Lord Zuckerman. Now, he's an evolutionist. He's not a creationist. After many years of searching for man's fossil ancestry, in his book, Beyond the Ivory Tower, published in 1970, Lord Zuckerman made the following statement. That's on page 64. No scientist could logically dispute the proposition that man, without having been involved in any act of divine creation, evolved from some ape-like creature in a very short space of time, speaking in geological terms, without leaving any fossil traces of the steps of the transformation. End of quote. You see what Lord Zuckerman is saying? That if we exclude the possibility of creation, obviously then man must have evolved from an ape-like creature. But if he did, there's absolutely no evidence for it in the fossil record. Is that what you read in your textbooks? Is that what you see in National Geographic on television? Absolutely not. But that is a considered judgment of this man after his many years of research and looking at things from an evolutionary bias at that. And that is my conclusion. When we see the fossil record, monkeys certainly appeared abruptly fully formed. Primates themselves appeared fully formed, and so did apes. And I'm convinced, in spite of the highly imaginative transitional form for man that has been suggested, man also has appeared abruptly fully formed. The next slide shows the famous Piltdown man. Here was a creature reconstructed from a few fragments of a jaw, a few fragments of a skull, found in a gravel pit near Piltdown, England in 1912. And the consensus of the world's greatest authorities was that he was an evolutionary form of man. Jawbone was quite ape-like, skull was quite man-like, But they put it all together, and here was our Piltdown man, our human ancestor. Turned out to be a hoax, a fraud. Somebody had taken a jawbone of an orangutan, a human skull, had treated them chemically to make them look old, filed the teeth to make them look manlike, put them in a gravel pit, and fooled the world's greatest authorities. The hoax succeeded because this is what they had expected, this is what they had wanted, you see, this is what they thought they were authorized to find. Now, in 1922, a single tooth was discovered in western Nebraska, brought to the attention of several of the world's leading authorities. They were very excited by the discovery of this tooth. It seemed to have many features that they would associate with some evolutionary form of man, some higher primate of some kind. And the Illustrated London News had their artist draw a picture of this Nebraska man based upon the descriptions of these scientists, and was published in the Illustrated London News in 1922. We see that on the next slide. Here's the famous Nebraska man and his wife and the tools that they were using, all based upon that one single tooth. I would say that science is really a fascinating subject, isn't it? Well, a few years later, they found some additional remains of this creature, and he turned out to be neither a man-like ape nor an ape-like man. He turned out to be a pig. That's right. It was a pig's tooth. A pig's tooth. Now, this is a lesson for us, ladies and gentlemen. I want you to look at that picture. Our suggested human ancestor based upon a pig's tooth. Now, you see, these people were good scientists. They were honest. They were sincere. But they were misled by what they had expected to find and what they had wanted to find, you see. Now, in the next slide, we see the version of Neanderthal man that appeared for nearly a century. We got his head cut off. Maybe we can get that down a bit. But this is the version of Neanderthal man that we had for nearly 100 years. They began to find fossils of this creature back in 1860. And they found fossils of these creatures all over Europe and other places around the world. Many places, as a matter of fact. And based upon a skeleton found in 1908, it appeared that he didn't quite walk upright, and so he is portrayed as this long-armed, knuckle-dragging, beetle-browed, stoop-shouldered, bow-legged subhuman. And he was called Homo neanderthalensis, our subhuman ancestor. Well, it turned out that that skeleton was of an arthritic old man. He didn't walk upright because he had a bad case of arthritis. When x-rays were developed, they x-rayed the bones and teeth of these Neanderthal people, and they all suffered severely from rickets, a vitamin D deficiency which causes the bones to become soft and deformed. And they have finally concluded that all of these so-called primitive features of Neanderthal man were due to these pathological conditions, and that he was actually Homo sapiens, man like you and I. As a matter of fact, about 20 years ago, a couple of scientists published an article in which they said, now, really, if you just take Neanderthal man, give him a shave and a haircut and a bath, put him in a business suit, no one would take a second look. Well, of course, that was 20 years ago, and today you wouldn't have to give him a shave or a haircut, would you? Some circles in San Diego, you wouldn't even have to give him a bath. Anything. But he has been upgraded to Homo sapiens. Now, you see, Neanderthal man was not our ancestor. Piltdown man was not our ancestor. Nebraska man was not our ancestor. Ramapithecus, which they've suggested as a transitional form, is now judged to be an ape. He's not our ancestor. And I'm suggesting that what else remains will fall out of that family tree of man. Now we want to look at some of the other aspects of the fossil record. May we have the next slide, please? And I want to look at some of the... that's the modern version of Neanderthal man. I obtained that from the American Museum of Natural History. That is what they think now he looked like, and as you see, he is just modern man. Next slide, please. Here's a statement from Dr. David Kitts, professor of geology at University of Oklahoma, in the journal Evolution, volume 28, 1974, taken from page 467. Now, Dr. Kitts is an evolutionist. He's a paleontologist. He certainly believes in evolution. I don't want to misrepresent this person. But in this article, he was discussing the problem of the gaps, the absence of transitional forms. And Dr. Kitts has made this statement: despite the bright promise that paleontology provides a means of seeing evolution, it has presented some nasty difficulties for evolutionists the most notorious of which is the presence of gaps in the fossil record. Evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them. End of quote. And you see what the man says? That although evolution requires these intermediate forms, the fossil record does not provide them. Well, you may ask, then why is he an evolutionist? Well, I'd have to say this. Certainly not because of the fossil record, but in spite of the fossil record, he remains an evolutionist. Dr. E.J.H. Corner is a botanist, Cambridge University. He's an evolutionist. Fact is, he published a chapter called Evolution in the book Contemporary Botanical Thought, published in 1961. On page 97 of that book, we find the following statement by this botanist, this evolutionist. We see in the next slide. Dr. Corner says that much evidence can be adduced in favor of the theory of evolution from biology, biogeography, and paleontology, but I still think that, to the unprejudiced, the fossil record of plants is in favor of spatial creation. End of quote. Now, I assume that Dr. Corner says that because he realizes that every one of the major plant kinds have appeared fully formed without transitional form. We see in the next slide an exhibit in the Chicago Museum of Natural History showing these various plants. Notice that they all come back to unknown ancestors. Unknown ancestors. No ancestors for these major plant kinds. A friend of mine visited London a few years ago. He found a book called Evolution, written by Dr. Colin Patterson, a senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, one of the world's leading authorities on fishes. And my friend enjoyed the book, and he noticed that Patterson invited comments from the readers. So my friend wrote to Dr. Patterson. He said, Dr. Patterson, I enjoyed your book very much. But he says, it would have been helpful if in your book you had supplied some examples of actual transitional forms. At the very least, perhaps you could have had an artist illustrate what you think these things should have looked like. Well, Dr. Patterson, in a letter dated the 10th of April, 1979, replied to my friend, thanked him for his letter, and then made the following statement. We see in the next slide. Dr. Patterson says, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. You suggest an artist should be asked to visualize such transformations, but where would he get the information from? And if I were to leave it to artistic license, would that not mislead the reader? End of quote. You notice what Dr. Patterson says? Now, there's a paleontologist, expert on the fossil record, sitting among one of the greatest collection of fossils in the world, and what does he say? You're right. I don't have any examples of transitional forms in my book. But if I had known of any, either among the fossils or among the living, I would certainly have included them. Now, I say to these people who say, oh, we know all about transitional forms, we got transitional forms, I say, please, would you write to Dr. Patterson, that poor man over there in London? He just seems to be so ignorant of all these transitional forms. Now, he says he doesn't know of any. And I think the man is being objective and very careful in his analysis of the evidence. As a matter of fact, Dr. Patterson said in a program on BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, that, and it was published in The Listener, the publication of the BBC, he said that people who fill in the trunk and the branches of the tree are just telling stories. That's all. He says the only thing we have of these evolutionary trees are the tips of the branches. All the rest is just storytelling of one kind or another. And all of this, furthermore, he says this idea of how all of this happened is just empty rhetoric as far as he is concerned. Now that's rather revealing, coming from a man of Dr. Patterson's stature, a man who'd been a convinced evolutionist for so many years of his life, to finally come to such a conclusion. Now let's go look at some other examples. The next slide. Here's the Cambrian animals. Animals found in so-called Cambrian rocks. Evolutionists believe that these rocks began to form 600 million years ago. They formed very slowly and gradually. Most of them did. Some of them may have formed catastrophically, but most of them formed slowly and gradually. I don't have the foggiest notion how you ever get fossils under those conditions. But they say that that's the way it happened. Took many millions of years to form. Now, in these Cambrian rocks, we have, as we see here on the slide, we see the trilobites, we see the sea urchin, we see the jellyfish, sponges, the swimming crustacean Sydnea, sea lilies, sea cucumbers, and there were many other creatures, very complex, brachiopods, worms, and things like that. These creatures are so complex, evolutionists believe their origin would have required nearly 2 billion years. Supposedly all of these creatures evolved from a little single-cell organism during the hundreds of millions of years preceding the Cambrian. Well, if that's the case, then underneath those Cambrian rocks, in the so-called Precambrian, we must find the evolutionary ancestors of these creatures, showing the transition from a single-cell microscopic creature into these creatures. What do we find in Precambrian rocks? Well, I'll tell you what we don't find. Nowhere on the face of this earth have we ever found an ancestor for a single one of those creatures. Every one of those creatures, I don't care where they're found or when they supposedly appeared on this earth, right from the start, a jellyfish is a jellyfish, a brachiopod is a brachiopod, a trilobite is a trilobite, and a sponge is a sponge, right from the very start, fully formed. But in those Precambrian rocks, now there's many reports of little fossils of little microscopic, single-cell, soft-bodied bacteria. Now look, if we can find fossils of bacteria and algae, little microscopic, single-cell, soft-bodied creatures, we could certainly find fossils of everything in between those creatures and these creatures. We have never found anything. Here is this vast explosion, fully formed of these creatures, and that's exactly the way the geologist refers to them, as the Cambrian explosion. That is remarkable support for creation. It is what we would expect on the basis of creation. But it's been one of these notorious difficulties for evolutionists ever since Darwin, and searching intensely for 120 years has failed to produce a single one of those so-called intermediate forms. Now, supposedly one of these invertebrates evolved into fish. They say it took about 100 million years. Now, wouldn't you suppose our museums would just be loaded down with these intermediate forms? Maybe it was a jellyfish, maybe it was a trilobite or brachiopod or worm or something like that, slowly and gradually change into fish. Billions times billions of those things would have lived and died during that 100 million years. Surely we have thousands and thousands and thousands of the intermediate forms in our museums. As a matter of fact, ladies and gentlemen, we don't have one. There is not one such transitional form available anywhere in any museum collection. Fish appeared absolutely, suddenly, fully formed on this earth. The next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Thought I had a statement by Dr. White there. Let me read a couple of statements about fishes. Dr. Gerald Todd of UCLA, an evolutionist, published an article in American Zoologist, Volume 20, 1980, in which he said the following: all three subdivisions of the bony fishes first appear in the fossil record at approximately the same time. They are already widely divergent morphologically, and they are heavily armored. How did they originate? What allowed them to diverge so widely? How did they all come to have heavy armor? And why is there no trace of earlier intermediate forms? End of quote. There's not a trace of any earlier intermediate forms. They're heavily armored. They're very different from one another. They appear fully formed, and absolutely no transitional forms whatsoever. Fishes just pop into existence suddenly. Now on this slide, we see the fish that supposedly gave rise to the amphibian. In the lower portion of the slide, we see what is supposed to be the world's oldest known amphibian. Evolutionists believe that the bones in the fins could have been transformed into the feet and legs of the amphibian. They point out some similarities in the vertebrae and a similarity in the pattern of bones in the skull. And they say that showed that fish was the ancestor. Please note, ladies and gentlemen, the fish was 100% fish. Beautifully designed for life in the water. Had a lovely set of fish fins. Notice, on the other hand, the amphibian. He has the basic amphibian limb. Feet and legs. Absolutely no transitional forms whatsoever. Notice the pelvic bone of the amphibian. Very large, firmly attached to the vertebral column. Notice the pelvic bone of the fish. Very small, loosely embedded in muscle. no connection to the vertebral column. None is needed. The fins do not support the weight of the body. Absolutely no transitional form. Millions and millions of years of evolution, no transitional form. These things just pop into existence fully formed. Next slide. Exhibit in Chicago Museum of Natural History, evolution of fish into amphibia. Notice in between a remarkable transitional form, half fish and half amphibian. But if you could read the fine print under that transitional form, you will find it is labeled inferred intermediate. Inferred indeed is strictly imaginary. No one has ever seen this thing. No museum in the world could produce it. Millions of years of evolution and not a trace of a transitional form. Next slide, please. And the dinosaurs, very quickly, Triceratops, 3 horns on the face, heavy bony armor shield, 8 to 10 tons. These horned dinosaurs appear fully formed. Next slide, Stegosaurus dinosaur. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Stegosaurus, notice those unusual plates along the back. The next slide shows the spikes on the tail. Notice those unusual spikes. Those are substantial structures. If these unique structures have slowly and gradually evolved, we should have many transitional forms. We have none. Next slide. And the Trachodon, a duck-billed dinosaur standing 18 feet high. The next slide shows the duck-bill. Jaws and teeth supposedly slowly and gradually evolved during millions of years into a duck-bill. We have all kinds of duck-billed dinosaurs, many of their fossils, not a single intermediate. Next slide, please. Well, I do declare, I don't know how that slide got in there. I didn't intend to show that. That's a picture of my grandson. Next slide, please. Here, I'm really proud of that little fellow. Here we see the Diplodocus, a huge plant-eating dinosaur. The next slide. And, of course, the Brontosaurus, about 40 tons, 80 feet long. Next slide. The largest dinosaur, the Brachiosaurus, standing 50 feet high, weighing up to 80 tons, and with the nostrils in a bony dome on the top of the head instead of out on the end of the snout. Now, there are no transitional forms for these things. I have a book called The Encyclopedia of Dinosaurs, and I looked through that book eagerly, looking for some suggestion of transitional forms, and there were none. Next slide, please. Here is a flying reptile. They are extinct, and I'm glad they are. This thing had a wingspread of about 50 feet or so. This was a pteranodon. Notice that all of these flying reptiles had an enormously long finger. And notice the long toothless beak and the bony crest and all of that. Now, according to evolution, we start out with an ordinary reptile, and then we had a genetic accident, and his finger got a wee bit longer, and for some strange reason, that was some favorable change of some kind, so he replaced the original, and then thousands of years later, maybe we got another genetic accident, and his finger got just a wee bit longer, and after many thousands and thousands and thousands of these genetic accidents, his finger got longer and longer and longer, and would you believe it now, just by chance, happened to generate a wing membrane and flight muscles and hollow bones and all of that. Now we had the flying reptile. There's absolutely not a trace of a transition form, ladies and gentlemen. These flying reptiles appear fully formed. No trace of a transitional form. Next slide. And the bat here is a fossil bat, the world's oldest known fossil bat, according to Dr. Glenn Jepson, who published this. This creature was 50 million years old, and he said he knew of nothing any older than this was remotely related to a bat. What is he? 100% bat. He appears abruptly fully formed, absolutely not a trace of a transitional form, and no change since. Same is true of the flying reptile, the flying insects. They suddenly appear fully formed. Now, quickly, I've only got a minute or so left, but in the next slide, we see Archaeopteryx. Oh, here we are. Finally, we have a transitional form. This is what is always presented as evidence for evolution. Now, we ought to have thousands and tens of thousands of undoubted transitional forms, but we always come back to Archaeopteryx. Note that Archaeopteryx was a bird. It had wings. It had a bird-like skull. It had perching feet. It was a bird. It had feathers identical to the feathers of modern birds, modern flying birds. And there's not a single transitional form between this bird and a reptile or between this bird and any other bird. He appears fully formed. Now, he had claws on the wings and he had teeth. And they say this is evidence that he came from a reptile. Well, in the next slide, we see a bird living today that has claws. This is a Hoatzin living in South America today. The juvenile Hoatzin has claws on the wing. The Turako of Africa has claws on the wing. The ostrich has claws on the wing. But no one would suggest for a moment that they are transitional form. And about teeth, well, Modern birds do not have teeth, but some ancient birds had teeth and some did not. And that's true of all different kinds of animals. Some have teeth and some don't. That's true of fishes, reptiles, amphibians. Perhaps some of us have teeth and some don't. But that doesn't indicate ultimate ancestry. All of these flying animals appeared fully formed without transition form. Ladies and gentlemen, I've just had time to give you just a glimpse of the record, but let me just say that I believe that the laws of science, the laws of probability, the incomparable complexity and beauty of living things, and the fossil record itself tells us that today the best statement that we can make about our origins is, in the beginning, God created. Thank you.
Nice to be back. It isn't often that you get a real chance to hear what, if you'll forgive me, I should refer to as quotation science. This isn't the way science works. And I think I'd like to give you, if you'll give me a chance, a little bit of a rough idea of at least one way of understanding the world. One of the things that I want to give you as a feeling is the way in which a theorist, the problem here is, I should explain, I am really a card-carrying theoretician. So when you see turkeys like Hoyle up on the board, we've had to deal with them for a long time. Why not? That's what makes science work. That's the beauty of it, it's controversy. This isn't. Evolution is a fact. I will not prove it. I will not attempt to prove it. But I hope I can show you how we understand it. And at least give you a feeling for why this isn't a debate. Let me point out a few things. The universe is at least 10 billion years old. That is a statement according to Dr. Chandra Wickramasinghe at the Arkansas trial in 1982. In fact, he said anybody who believes in a young Earth is an idiot. I don't go that far. He does. That's the last quotation I'm going to come out with. I'm going to show you some of the evidence. One of the beauties of the night sky, and if you'll forgive me, being an astronomer, I'd like to give you an idea of the way that the world is seen when you look at it from a global point of view. And admittedly, we'll be arguing the question of the evolution of life, but evolution, and I fully agree with Dr. Huxley's comment, really is a global way of understanding the world, because it leaves open this beautiful myriad of questions that we can begin to understand and contemplate with, and maybe even learn something from if we're really smart. The world as we see it is a snapshot, frozen in time because of the span of our lives. And it's that kind of snapshot that we have to try to interpret, to disentangle. Yes, I will readily admit there was no human around at the time of the creation. There was no human around when the Alps were raised. There was no human around when the San Andreas first appeared. But if you say that we can't study them, then what you've just done is to deny the very nature of science, which is the reconstruction of the past, the prediction of new observations, and the eventual reconstruction of a whole global structure of the physical world. When we look out at the night sky, what we see are some very simple basic constituents. Stars, gas, dust, all of which are both constituents of our galaxy and of other galaxies. Now, the first thing that we have to argue here is the nature of the time scale. As far as the question of the first event, I don't care who laid the egg, except perhaps this debate. I don't care whether the hydrogen that came out of that came in the form of hydrogen sulfide because the egg was rotten, or came out as a free-form gas. In fact, we didn't start out with hydrogen, and I think I can give you an example of that too, because a good deal of your tax dollars are going to a place called Fermilab in Illinois, where particles, hydrogen nuclei, protons, are being smashed together to understand the internal constituents of the proton, which in fact is essentially a simulation of the early universe. Now, what I want to get you to realize is this. The intuition has a limit. We haven't experienced everything, and if you think you have, then you really are going to be missing a lot of living and thinking. And because we haven't experienced everything, sometimes we have to be guided by the understanding that we've gained of the way that the world currently operates, and try to go then by theoretical and experimental means into those realms which are inaccessible to us, either because they're remote in the past, difficult to attain in length scale, difficult to reach in energy, or essentially impossible to replicate. If you'll allow me a little bit of leeway here, I'd like to take you on a journey. And let's see what happens. Let me see the first slide, please. This is the way it all changed, not began. Sometime between 15 and 20 billion years ago, I realize that seems like a very big error, but I ask you to remember that the American budget has that kind of error in it too. In the early state of the universe, it would seem I'm asserting, the universe was very hot, very dense, incredibly compact, basically an egg that was ready to go crack, and which did because somebody turned the gas on. That's not the way around that we understand the world to have been formed by. We look here and now out into space. We see two basic empirical facts. The universe is expanding. Never mind what it's expanding into. We'll get into that. We actually are. We're getting into it every second. But in addition to that, we see the evidence in the origin of the elements, that the abundances of the heavy metals, the abundances of those things out of which you're composed, Carl Sagan's star stuff, is constantly changing over the evolutionary history of the universe. If you think that you can't build, quote, complex nuclei from, quote, simple nuclei, I show you this slide as an example of a random calculation that was done by, in fact, Wagner, Fowler, and Fred Hoyle in 1967, published in the APJ. Oh, I'm sorry, the Astrophysical Journal. I slip into jargon sometimes. On the top, you'll see the time scale. You'll notice it's in seconds. And what you're seeing here is the change in the abundance of the different elements as a function of time. Now, if what Dr. Gish has told you about the second law of thermodynamics were the way in which the world worked, then everything that happens on the right side of this diagram should be completely impossible. Because, unfortunately, you see, this program, which did the nuclear reactions, by the way, they're the same ones that happen in a hydrogen bomb, were, in fact, computed assuming the second law of thermodynamics to hold. The universe was expanding, it was cooling. At the same time, the reactions between the various constituents were permitted, and they occurred at random, pure fluctuations. You notice what happens. You start out with P, which is protons, N, which is neutrons, and what you wind up with is absolutely impossible. Helium, deuterium, and even a little bit of lithium. Well, if you can do that in the universe, it should be trivially possible to do it now. Because if the natural laws were operating in the same way, then one should be able to argue that it is physically realistic to be building up heavy metals now in the universe. I hope you'd agree with that kind of logical inference. The fact is that that must be true, or else we wouldn't have a nuclear arsenal. Because the principle of formation of a hydrogen bomb is precisely fusion, which takes place under the second law of thermodynamics. Yes, it's an explosion, but you get out heavy nuclei. It's an explosion because the rapid release of energy cannot be contained by the apparatus which was built to keep the temperature rising quickly. Therefore, in an explosion, you have complexity. Therefore, in an explosion of the Big Bang, you have the beginnings of nuclear synthesis. Next step. You find from detailed calculations that it is physically impossible to bridge the gap between lithium and the stuff that you are primarily made of: carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus. That happens later. The first thing that has to happen is that stars are formed, which would seem to be absolutely nonsensical given the idea that what we're dealing with here is a very complex, disordered system. Let me give you a demonstration. I shall show you a remarkable property of matter. Remember the one that Dr. Gish said doesn't exist, that nature doesn't tend to organize. Which direction did that fall in? Matter, gravitation, organizes. Gravitation is an attractive force. And therefore, if a fluctuation becomes large enough, it is possible for matter to clump. If that matter clumps, and we are not talking about so-called living matter, we're just talking about stars. Big balls of gas, remember? A couple of 100,000 kilometers across. There are lots of them. I was glad to hear Dr. Gish say that there are of order 100 billion of them. Saved me the trouble of saying it. But in that fall, there is a release of energy. The system is going to a lower energy state. If we take a sphere of gas and let it collapse in on itself, it goes to an ordered structure by Dr. Gish's definition. It goes to a semi-spherical structure, which is a star, at the center of which the temperature can become high enough for nuclear reactions to be occurring. In those nuclear reactions, you have two things: the release of energy in the form of light, which is that radiant form that we call heat, and the building up of heavier constituent nuclei. Those are inevitable products of the second law of thermodynamics. They're not just an aberration of the current universe. We see that stars form. We can see them in the constellation Orion, which actually you should be able to see tonight if the weather is clear. Look in the direction of the belt. That is a region, the most active one in the galaxy, short of the galactic center, in which stars are forming today. That is an understanding that we get from evolution. Let's go to the next slide. One of the arguments that you might think you could bring up is the fact that the stars at night are orderly. Take this one as the night sky. I'm sure if I ask any of you who might by chance be amateur astronomers and enjoy contemplating the beauties of the night sky, I think you should be able to find a fair number of constellations in this slide. If you really look hard, that you would take as an indication of order. How many of you do find that? How many of you can see some patterns in that? Well, I shouldn't do this, but That's a portion of a globular cluster. That's not the night sky at all. It's just a small piece about that big of the whole sky. And if you actually work it out, that's purely random. But you found order. You wanted to find order. It's perfectly normal to find order. But that's random. And that's the way the universe is constructed. The distribution of the stars and galaxies that came out of the Big Bang give us the memory in the universe, in the physical world, of the initial conditions. The universe was then and is now a random structure in which local order occurs, because those are stars. Each one of those is a sun in its own right, building elements in its core and slowly evolving. But it's randomly distributed. Let's go to the next slide. This is the way we learn about the universe. Those are nice fingernails. This is observers. Theorists have dirty fingers. The reason I bring this up is because one of the things you probably know about is the Hale telescope at Mount Palomar, the 200-inch. That enormous light bucket is constructed for one reason: to produce a plate about that size. That is a fingerprint. Not this, but the plate itself. Because on that plate is the unique signature of a galaxy. In this case, over the hard-fought long nights of 40 years, we have built up a picture of the universe which comes from these fingerprints. The first statement we can make is the universe is expanding. Unless we are universally repulsive to every bloody galaxy in the sky, every galaxy in the sky is moving away from us. With one exception, and that's the Andromeda galaxy, a common center with which we are orbiting. That time scale for the runaway of all these galaxies is the time scale for the basic evolutionary constraint, how long the universe has been around for. There is no serious question that the time scale, in fact, there was an article in Nature by Sandage and Taman just 2 days ago, before I came here, which gave this time scale. The universe is at least 10 billion years old. The galaxies we see are at least that old. Now, if that were the case, then as we look backward in time, if the galaxies have been steadily building up this abundance of the heavy metals, we should, to use Dr. Gish's phrase, be seeing thousands of transition forms. We should be seeing thousands of stars which have low metallicity because they were formed at an earlier stage in the history of the galaxy. They were formed at an earlier stage in the life of the universe, and so they shouldn't be as complex. What do we find? Thousands of transition forms, a whole population of them, called population 2. These are the stars that were formed on the order of 8 to 10 billion years ago. They were the first stars that were formed in the galaxy. When we look at them, we see that they have fewer metals than the sun, less carbon, less nitrogen, by at least 2 orders of magnitude. I hope we can get into more discussion of this because I've been spending the last 3 years working on this problem. It's been one of the great excitements of my life. I hope I can get some more of that across to you too. Next slide. This is an indication of the expansion of the universe. Now the way this works is that the velocity is on the vertical scale and the brightness is on the horizontal scale. This is looking over a time scale of roughly 8 billion years. It's all the galaxies that are bright enough to be worked on. And what one finds is that they work out a very nice relationship. The distance is proportional to the velocity. That's the expansion of the universe. That's the evidence. It's not one point. It's a whole cluster of them. Next. Next slide. This is something... Can we have the lights down a little bit more, please? I hope you can really enjoy this slide. This is the universe. This blotch, you're looking at the plot of 1 million galaxies plotted in the northern hemisphere, the so-called Shane-Wirtanen catalog. Looking at this right now, I'm actually struck by something that Dr. Gish quoted to you. Asimov's quote about we can just let the dust form. Does this look vaguely like dust? The stringy structures that you're used to, the things that form just spontaneously in your bedroom. Those very complex, stringy structures that form by sedimentation in gravitational fields apparently spontaneously in your bedroom. Those aren't simple or chaotic. Those are complex. Those are highly ordered polymers. And these are highly ordered structures. There are holes in that, you would think. There are strings in that, you would think. Those bright knots that you see here and here are clusters. Several thousand galaxies that formed at the same time. This looks too ordered to possibly have come out of the Big Bang. If you look in detail at the distribution of the strings and the holes, they're random. Exactly like that star field. Again, the universe bespeaks its origins. The universe was formed in a state of chaos. There's nothing wrong with that because the order that we see is local order. If it were impossible for order to occur, if the second law of thermodynamics, as Dr. Gish presented it to you, could indeed take place, the simplest of all ordered structures, a snow crystal, would be impossible. Because a snow crystal takes place, its formation takes place by the nucleation of atoms in a solution which is cooling spontaneously. If the temperature gets low enough, the innate attractive forces among the polar molecules of water form a very complex hexagonal structure. And indeed, there are many other more complex structures which form exactly the same way. I'll give you one more example before I go further. The dust that we see in the interstellar medium, and we do see the dust, we can pick it up. It falls on the moon. We've collected it from satellites. We know that it exists because of the polarization of starlight. That dust, which is composed primarily of graphite, is an ordered structure. And yet it's formed in the hostile environment of the interstellar medium, where the densities are of order 1 particle per cubic centimeter. For comparison, this room is one in which the density is about 10 to the 20th particles per cubic centimeter. A reasonable approximation of a vacuum. And yet, in that environment, it's possible to form such complex structures. I realize that it seems as if I'm throwing a lot at you. I would like to give you a feeling, though, for the kind of scope that one must deal with when confronting this issue. It's not simply that we have this beautifully compartmentalized way of knowing the world, in which there's life and non-life, in which there's creationist and evolutionist. There's scientist and there's anti-scientist. But that's all. If you're a scientist, your view is all-encompassing, because your curiosity should be unbounded. Let's go on to the next slide. This is the most improbable event you'll ever see. We know thousands of them. If you calculate what the probability of 2 galaxies colliding at random will be, you will find that it should be impossible to find galaxy collisions, and yet there they are. By the way, that number isn't artificial. This is number 242 in a catalog of something like 400 of them, found by Halton Arp in the 1960s. This is an actual collision in which we can even detect the relative motion of the 2 galaxies. That's not just gas that you see streaming between them. Those are stars. And somewhere on there, there may even be a group of life forms wondering about creationism versus evolution while they go tumbling off into the infinity of space. Kind of puts it in perspective, doesn't it? Those galaxies, and others like them, are complex forms which have changed in time, and we've seen these changes. Not in any one galaxy any more than in any one species, necessarily, because the time scale given to humans is small, incredibly short. We don't have the advantage of either longevity or budget. Mainly budget. Next slide. These are the oldest stars you'll ever see. This is the globular cluster M13, which is in the direction of Hercules. The reason I show this is twofold. One is the fact that it's in this direction that the sun is moving. I just thought you'd like to know where you're going. But the other is that the stars in this system have about 1/10 the amount of metals that our galaxy, our sun, us, have. This is one of the systems that formed early in the history of the galaxy. You may ask me why it formed. I think I have an idea, but right now it's only an idea. The very fact that I can't give you a cut and dry answer should be an indication of the fact that there's something interesting in science, because I can't just point to that and give you a Kipling just so story. I might try to, but I'm too honest for that, at least today. The main reason that I say I don't know is because there are some puzzles that are still presented by this. For example, we know why the metallicity is low, but we don't know why it formed the spherical shape. People are calculating that now to see if they can possibly come up with an explanation. Maybe there is a physical law that we don't understand that's lurking here. That would be very interesting. In fact, that we would learn from. But not one thing that I've heard Dr. Gish say tonight is an indication of a physical law that I can learn from. I haven't even heard the physical laws, I'm afraid. Let me give you another example, because this is a system which looks very orderly and is in fact formed by the second law of thermodynamics. 2 days ago, a colleague of mine produced a computer program which was supposed to test precognition. This was as a joke. It had a random number generator, and the probability of guessing 50 random numbers between 0 and 9, this sounds vaguely like the Hoyle-Wickramasinghe argument, I think, should have been 5 out of 50. After all, if you run it 50 times and you're choosing between 10 numbers, you've got a chance of 1 in 10. Okay? You notice my fingers never leave my hand. Now, if we go the next step, we can calculate what the probability is of getting 6 right, 7 right, or 10 right. The chances are absolutely astronomical of simply walking in, sitting down at that machine, the random number generator had been tested, and calculating a priori, from first principles, the probability for getting 9 or 10 right. A first shot meant that in the entire history of this country, it should never have happened. My colleague tested it himself, did 3 runs, came out perfectly. In fact, he doesn't have precognition. He scored below chance on one of them. I sat down and got 9 out of 50. First shot. Gee, thanks. What I'm trying to tell you is that that should never have happened. Neither should the formation of ribonuclease, but it did. A priori probabilities are an indication sometimes of your ignorance of the conditions, because that was a lousy random number generator. I know I don't have precognition. I may know all the arguments that will be brought up tonight, but that's not an indication of precog. What I do know is that there was something else that was not completely random going on in that system. And what I can also know is that in the origin of the prebiotic molecules on Earth, there was something that was not just completely hit or miss. Some molecules were energetically favored states. And that's what breaks the symmetry of Hoyle and Wickramasinghe's argument. That's what breaks the purely random argument. It's not just flipping a coin and getting a probability of runs of heads or tails. It's much more complex than that, and you know it, because you've seen what the structures of molecules can look like. It's not just arbitrarily taking a few hydrogen atoms here and going, and letting them stick. Much more complex. That complexity is given to you by the quantum mechanical laws. And that is where the symmetry of the problem breaks. Yes, for example, we see that all of life is a particular helicity. DNA is mostly right-handed, but there's a left-handed variety. We see that in amino acids found from meteorites, there are both right and left-handed. On the Earth, we see only one kind, right-handed. Or left-handed, doesn't matter. Something broke the symmetry. In this room, most of you are right-handed. Equal probability of each. Something broke the symmetry. Those of you who were forced to write right-handed when you were kids will probably remember that the thing that broke the symmetry was your teacher. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's an ordered intelligence outside. It also doesn't mean your teacher was an ordered intelligence. Let's go to the next slide. This is a star dying. And if you think we don't know about stellar birth, this one we know about. In 1054, supernova exploded that was observed by the Chinese and the Arabs. It was called the Golden Eagle by the Chinese, and it was recorded in several Arabic chronicles. That was the death of a star. The thing that's remnant here was something predicted by evolutionary models, that when a star evolves, it should form a dead relic in the core when it explodes. Stars between about 2 and 10 times the mass of the sun should form neutron stars. The center of that booger is a neutron star, spinning around with a period of 33 milliseconds. It's a very good clock. We can even calculate how good a clock because it's slowly spinning down. And if we understand the physical laws, then we should be able to find from that spin down that it traces back to the time of the origin of the supernova. Within experimental error, it does, to within 100 years. And considering that right now our understanding of the physics of neutron stars is only 15 years old, I think that's doing pretty well. After all, the supernova occurred over 900 years ago, so to get an error of 10%, I think is pretty close. I'll just remind you that most of you probably haven't balanced your checkbooks that effectively. I'm a theoretician and I can't. But this one also contains another statement. There should be heavier metals in this than we see in the interstellar medium. An abundance study was just done at University of Michigan. It's been duplicated, I emphasize that word, at Maryland and at several other places. There's more iron and nickel in that than there is in the general interstellar medium. It was formed in the supernova event and spewed back out as an effluence into the galaxy. That effluence eventually becomes the nails in the chairs you're sitting on, the beams that are holding this up, us. If you want to put it in those terms, you don't have to. We are, in that sense, the products of the whole evolutionary history of the galaxy. Through things like this, which have formed huge cauldrons in which the materials have been cooked. Not half-baked. Next slide. Now, another indication that the antiquity of the Earth is impossible, according to most creationists, is that the magnetic field of the Earth is decaying. I mean, you heard the argument that the world is running down. Your bodies are running down. Jack LaLanne is running down. This This is the data that is supposed to be an indication that if we trace the magnetic field back to as old an Earth as Dr. Gish and his colleagues would like to think we don't have, a few billion years, we find that the world cannot be that old because the magnetic field wouldn't be contained. It's very convincing data. You notice that it's age before present. This is all historical data. I think, in fact, I know all of you are willing to grant that the Roman Empire occurred 2,000 years ago. And that there were people around then, I hope. Looks very convincing, a secular trend, everything running down. Does it? I mean, I'd like an opinion. Because this is the real stuff. Next slide. This is the real data. Dr. Barnes of the Institute for Creation Research has only shown the first slide in various discussions, especially in his polemics in Impact. This is the real data. Over historical time, 9,000 years before present. The magnetic field is not decaying, it's fluctuating. And in fact, if we look on time scales of millions of years, we find that it's reversing. The magnetic field of the Earth is another prediction of evolutionary models. This was predicted in 1957 by Malkus at MIT when he did a calculation of the way in which the magnetic field was generated. The Earth is acting as essentially a magnetic generator, and that is also in accord with the second law of thermodynamics. It's impossible for the creationist position to understand this point, because you would have to throw out all of the data before 2,000 years ago. But it's been historically dated by archaeologists and by written records. And if I showed you the details, you would see that there were fluctuations even in that. The magnetic field of the Earth is in fact slowly increasing. A further piece of evidence, if the magnetic field were decaying, and I'm bringing this up now because we're going to have a lot of discussion about this later, then there should have been a change in Jupiter's magnetic field too, and Saturn's magnetic field also, between the successive flybys of the various space probes, if it were simply decaying. Between Voyager 1 and 2 and Pioneer 11, there should have been a change in the magnetic field of Jupiter if it were a secular, one-way in time decrease. No change. Consistent with the picture that it's a dynamo field, impossible in the position that the Earth and the cosmos are young. I've got to step back here and make a point. Through all of this, Dr. Gish presented the most distorted view I have yet heard him present of what evolution is. So let me tell you. Evolution is the statement that the world is not 10,000 years old. Evolution is the statement that the diversity we see in the world is the result of naturalistic processes. Evolution is the statement that any other statement which smacks of religion has no bearing on anything but what that person believes, and that evolution can say nothing on that question. On that, I completely agree with Dr. Gish. On that, I will not debate, because it's not science. But to say that that is somehow incorporated in the statement of evolution, and not say that it's simply something about which we can say nothing and therefore will say nothing, that's different. Let me go make an even stronger statement. When Hoyle and Wickramasinghe come out in a tabloid in London and say they put their heads together and said there is a God, they are not acting as scientists. If they had come out and said, we're atheists, we find scientifically there is no God, they are not scientists. That's a statement of belief. That is not a statement of science. And science has nothing to say on statements of belief, or should. I will not say anything on that point. whatever I feel personally about the origin of the entire universe, all I'll say is that I hold with Aquinas, and I will end it there. But I will say that the universe is not 10,000 years old. I will say that the compelling evidence is that the complexity we see in the universe could not possibly have come about in that short a time. I will say that there is compelling evidence that if the flood occurred, which I noticed Dr. Gish did not talk about, the rate of speciation required to produce the observed kinds now is so great that the observations contradict creationism now, because the observed rate of speciation in the last 5,000 years should be so great that some of you should be popping up in different forms periodically. It would make things very interesting. But we'll get to that. I'm sure we will get to that, Dr. Gish. Next slide. Okay, this is the history of the Earth in one easy lesson. This is the evidence that we have on the origin of the various rock formations. Specifically, one thing. Something that I noticed wasn't discussed. If the Earth is as old as it is, then going all the way back to the beginning, we should see evidence for fixity of the Earth's atmosphere. If the life that we see arose in an environment exactly like ours, then contemporaneous with the oldest fossils, we should see evidence that the environment was basically the same. I hope you'll grant me that. What we find instead is that the environment was very different. Red beds, for instance, which are the indication of Fe3+, it's an ion of iron that combines with oxygen, don't appear in the fossil record, in the geologic record, until about 2 billion years ago, with a proverbial capital billion. That is an indication that until that time, there was little or no free oxygen. The atmosphere was genuinely different. Now, if the atmosphere at that time was different, then the processes that we infer for the origin of life by observing the conditions in the laboratory now, if we simply take a test tube of air, say in this room, schmutz it down, put a little fire under it and let it go, you should lead us nowhere. If the atmosphere as we see it now were indeed the one under which life evolved, then we shouldn't be here. But the evidence that we have from the geologic record, very compelling evidence from the structure of that column, is that the atmosphere was largely reducing mostly hydrogen-based compounds, hydrocarbons, with very little free oxygen up until about 2 billion years ago. What we find in the fossil record is that that's just about the time that diversity begins to appear in the record. The two of these were separate observations that were brought together. They weren't things that we, in great desperation, went out, wringing our hands to say, ha-ha, we've got to find some evidence, ha-ha. Actually, what happened was that the red beds in Michigan and in the central United States had been observed by people who were doing iron mining for years. They succeeded in dating it by using potassium argon and uranium lead dating, radioactive dating. At the same time, the diversity of the fossil record was indicating that the Cambrian was not the time of the origin of life. You see, we had learned something since Darwin. We haven't been sitting on our rumps for the last 125 years, you see. We haven't been knuckle walking, we've been trying to learn. And what we've learned is that the diversity of life that we see in the Cambrian is the evidence of the end of a process, not the beginning. The diversity of all of you in this room is an indication of the end of a process, not a beginning. There were a variety of random things that brought you here. You couldn't have predicted, at least I couldn't have predicted, that any one of you would wind up in this room, yet you're here by a series of events which you can trace back. had to do with environment. It had to do with interactions among groups. And it's the same thing that we see when we look at the diversity of the Cambrian. We see the end of the cycle of diversity that began in what is now called the Endochean rocks, those that underlie the Cambrian, those that Dr. Gish said contain only microorganisms. Well, they do contain worms. They do contain corals. They do contain things which evolve into the kinds of animals that become trilobites. They do contain things which eventually are ancestral to crinoids and to the other brachiopods. The point being that that time scale is relatively short, maybe 100 million years. By geologic time scales, that's trivial. By astrophysical time scales, that's a drop in the bucket. But it does occur, and we do see the forms. Now let me make another point on that. When you're dealing with the survival of examples of a transitional form, you might think that it is ridiculous that we should see algae in very great numbers, and yet we don't see, for example, many transitional forms between different types of dinosaurs. Think about the way algae grow. Go out to a pond in the spring or the summer and stare at it. They form mats. These mats can sediment. They're colonies. We don't see many single algae floating around in a rock in New Zealand or another rock in Central Australia, or desperately go clambering up into Greenland to hammer out a piece of the UMATIC gneiss just to get one bloody little microorganism. We get whole colonies of them. On the other hand, single organisms have a very small probability of surviving. Think of the number of three-headed cows you've seen. They're infrequent in number, but they do take place. You won't find them in the fossil record, but if it were an advantageous form, you would find the descendants, which might not be three-headed, but might have some extended neck or something like that. We'll get into that, I'm sure, in the rebuttal period. Let's go to the next slide. This is an example of what underlies the underlying rocks of the Endochean. These are algal examples, actually prokaryotes, which are of order 2.5 to 3.5 billion years old, that are found in northern Canada. Some of the oldest rock that we can date. Thank you. These are examples from the gunflint chert. These are the oldest forms of life. It is, I will admit, a very long way from those to you. May not be as far to me. But there's something to consider in that. It's a very long way, but it's a very long time. A lot's happened in that time. The universe has changed quite a bit. The Earth has changed quite a bit. When these characters first appeared, the abundance of free oxygen was 1 part in 100,000 what it is now. On the other hand, these were capable of surviving in an ultraviolet-rich atmosphere that you would die in, copper tone notwithstanding. That's simply because you're the product of an evolution in an oxidizing atmosphere, and these little characters were the product of evolution in a reducing atmosphere. Now, Dr. Gish has said that we've never seen the origin of anything. Well, we've seen the origin of organic compounds when we put them in the laboratory in the Miller-Urey experiment. They come out exactly as the kinds of compounds that would have been precursors of life. And that's all that we need say. More will certainly be said on that, too. Next. Nice example of an average transitional form. This is Seymoria. I should point out, just for an example, Dr. Gish asserted that there are no transitional forms. A fish is a fish, a gish is a gish, and that's very important to realize. Because Colin Patterson may say that there are no transitional forms, but there is also no transitional form between a monarchist and an anti-monarchist. Those are discrete groups. Anybody in between may be called a member of the Labor Party, I don't know. But the essential point is that the discreteness of the taxonomic system constrains Colin Patterson and his colleagues to work either as something of one type or another. Every one of you sitting in this room who holds citizenship papers is an American, by definition. If you held citizenship papers from Switzerland or Tanganyika or Kenya, that would be your citizenship. By definition, you'd be classified that way. Whatever your origin is, whatever your ancestry is. Now, you know your ancestry, but the government doesn't care when it creates a taxonomic grouping. You're either alien or you're resident. You're either visiting or you're not. You're either a reptile or an amphibian in a system that doesn't allow for an intermediate. But the ancestry will still show. Now, in your case, it may be in your name. It may be in certain, for example, Tay-Sachs disease that some people carry with them. It may be in sickle cell anemia that some people carry with them. It may be in some genetic effect that was the product of an environment. Or it may just be in a memory, a photograph that you have. But the point is, somebody looking at your papers, and the fossil record is nothing but a bureaucratic list. Somebody looking at your papers will classify you, and you're stuck with that. This is called an amphibian. But it has reptilian features, and there is no doubt that they're reptilian. But it's still mostly amphibian, so it belongs to the group amphibian. Next slide. This is a pelycosaur, which is characteristic of a whole group that existed in the Permian. It's one of nature's more extravagant experiments. Nature isn't constrained by the Office of Management and Budget. Many forms have been formed, usually in small numbers because they're just duds. Not important. There's always more genetic material. But this is characteristic of a whole group. We've seen the scales change. We've seen the fins change. We see the structures changing. They're not all the same. They look alike. But they're not the same genus. They're not the same species. Next slide. I'll come back to that a little bit later. Let's go on. Just so you know, that was Darwin's finches. This is an ash kill that took place 12 million years ago in Nebraska. You want to see something that formed in catastrophic events? This is a catastrophe. An entire herd of rhinoceros were killed in one fell swoop. One of them was pregnant. We've even seen the products of that pregnancy.